What a beautiful sight. We're here in the Judean desert, looking down there at the city of Jericho. Jericho in the Jordan Valley. Beyond that, we can see the Moab Mountains. And here in the Judean desert, we can clearly see the path of Wadi Kelt, or Nachal Prat in Hebrew. This is the valley that was used in antiquity as a passageway leading up to Jerusalem. So this is really a beautiful sight, especially when you look to the south and you can see how close we are to the Dead Sea. Now, Jericho is the center of our story here. Jericho, the city of palms. Jericho, the city of curse. Jericho, the city of healing. Now, Jericho was founded on a mound known as Tel as-Sultan, the mound of the Sultan, the ruler, back in the Neolithic era. Some scholars believed, until recently, that Jericho was a city in the Neolithic era, and therefore it was nicknamed the first city in the world. However, this is not true. Scholars would agree today that we probably misinterpreted the archaeological finds, and that what we thought were fortifications from the Neolithic era around 10 or 9,000 years ago are actually not fortifications, and therefore there is no city there in the Neolithic era. Jericho is indeed a very old city. It was founded as a city in the early Bronze Age. That's around 5,000 years ago, along with other cities in the region such as Megiddo and Chatzor and Hebron. But not Jerusalem. Jerusalem will have to wait for another 1,000 years until it becomes a city. So Jericho is, yes, it's one of the earliest cities in the region, but not the earliest. After the Canaanite period, Jericho was conquered by the tribes of Israel. This is the famous story of Joshua and the tribes of Israel invading Canaan, and the walls of Jericho falling once the people of Israel went around it in a procession and blow the trumpets, and suddenly the walls of Jericho fall down. We haven't found these fallen walls in archaeology, but the story is that indeed they fell during that procession around the city walls 7 times, and suddenly they fall. The Bible says that Jericho was conquered by the Jews, and eventually it became a Jewish city, also in the first temple period. The Bible relates that when Joshua took over Jericho and destroyed the city, he cursed it. He said that no one shall build Jericho ever again. But that didn't stop people in the first temple period from rebuilding the city, paying a very heavy price during that. The man who built Jericho, well, he lost his children. That was the curse. Yet, even though there was a curse, there was also a cure. So yes, the city was rebuilt in the first temple period, and from that period we hear about the city as the city of palms, because of the dates that were extremely good in Jericho. Later, in the second temple period, after the destruction of the country by the Babylonians, the Jews returned to their homeland, and they also returned to Jericho. Hundreds of them come back to Jericho, and they rebuild the city, but not at the Tel, rather a bit south, where Jericho is today, what we see now, next to the mouth of Wadi Kelt, the main route leading to Jerusalem. The city was an important city at that time. The Hasmoneans built palaces in Jericho. King Herod the Great in the 1st century BC builds his palaces, 3 palaces, not just one, next to Jericho, with big swimming pools and lavish gardens and so on and so forth. Jericho is renowned in those days not only for the dates coming from Jericho, but also for a very unique commodity that was produced in the region of Jericho. It is the balsam. It is the most expensive product coming from Jericho, a perfume that was valued all over the Roman Empire. So Jericho is indeed an extremely important city. But the question is, what brought Jesus to Jericho? As in the case of the baptism site, the connection between Jesus and Jericho is double-fold. It has two layers, two levels, the practical one and the spiritual one. Let's begin with the practical one. Jesus comes to Jerusalem, and on his way he stops at Jericho. There are other routes leading to Jerusalem at that time. He could have taken the mountain route, the Patriarch's Road, but that would be not such a good idea, as this is the territory of the Samaritans, the foes, the hostile population of the Samaritans. It's not such a good idea to walk through there if you're a Jew. Another possible route would be the coastal plain, but that's also a very bad idea. That's the center of Roman control in this land at the time. It's Caesarea. It's the other cities, mainly occupied by Gentiles, by non-Jews. So Jesus prefers to go along what's today is known as Route 90, the Jordan Valley route. And on the way, of course, Jericho is a station where everyone stops. It is the last important station before ascending to Jerusalem. From Jericho, through Wadi Kelt, you go up to the west to Jerusalem. But as I said earlier, there's also the spiritual connection. Mind you, Jericho is linked to Jerusalem in a very special way. Mostly people aren't aware of that, but Jericho is not just the last important station before reaching Jerusalem. Jericho has a deep connection with the holy city. According to the sages, the Jewish rabbis, according to their testimony, priests lived in Jericho. 12 priestly watches, priestly families lived in Jericho. And every month they would go up to Jerusalem and come back. Half of them serving at the temple, the other half remaining in Jericho and taking care of their brothers with food and supplies and water. The rabbis say that from Jericho you could actually smell the scent of the incense on the altar in the temple of Jerusalem. You could hear the great doors of the temple opening here in Jericho. The temple and Jericho are intimately connected, and therefore, when in the Second Temple period they brought the new fruits to Jerusalem, every year they would bring dates only from Jericho. Jericho and Jerusalem, sister cities. But that's not the entire story, because in the New Testament we hear about two events that took place in Jericho. When Jesus arrives in Jericho, he performs a miracle, a type of miracle that he already performed in other places, such as in Jerusalem. In one case, Jesus performs a miracle of curing, healing a blind person. His name is Bartimaeus, and he's on the outskirts of Jericho. According to one version of the Gospels, he was on the way to Jericho. According to another version, it was when Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, and he heals the blind. But the most important story about Jesus in Jericho, of course, is the story about the tax collector named Zacchaeus, in Hebrew, Zakkai. By the way, the name Zakkai means someone who's innocent. It's very interesting because the last thing Zakkai is innocent. He was a criminal. He was a sinner. He was a tax collector. He was a collaborator with the Romans, probably very wealthy. He made a lot of money on the back of the poor. So obviously, tax collectors like Zakkai were hated by the ordinary people. They despised them. They looked at them as sinners. And when Jesus comes to Jericho, There are many people around receiving him gladly. And Zacchaeus wants to see what happens. He's so excited, but he can't see anything because he's too short. So he climbs on top of a sycamore tree, a tree that they still show today in Jericho. Maybe it's the original tree, who knows? But he climbs up and he looks at Jesus. And Zacchaeus is captivated by Jesus. And he invites him to his house to eat. And Jesus says, I will come. Now, people around him criticize him immediately. How can you do such a thing? How do you go to the house of a tax collector? He's an outcast in many senses. He's not a righteous person. Yet Jesus says, I have to go there because my aim is not to go to the healthy people. My aim is to go to the sick, to the needy, to the ill, and cure them. That is the main issue here. It's very interesting, the concept of what evil is, according to Jesus in this sentence. The evil person isn't really evil. He is sick, he is ill. He can be corrected, he can be healed, just like a leper, just like a blind person. And Jesus goes to dine and stay at the house of Zacchaeus. And the sinner repents. At the end of the story, Zacchaeus, innocent in Hebrew, who was a sinner, truly becomes an innocent person and a believer and a righteous person. From a sociological point of view, it's extremely important. It shows how Jesus approaches not just the ordinary people, but the outcasts, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, the lepers, those people ignored by society, despised by society. But it's very important from a spiritual perspective also to understand that it can happen only in Jericho, in a sense, because Jericho is the place of healing. Already in the time of Joshua, as we've mentioned earlier, the city is cursed. It is doomed. No, it is rebuilt in the first temple period by the Jews. Yes, whoever built it paid a heavy price, but the city revived. It is no longer a desolate ruin. During the first temple period, in the beginning of the first temple period, we hear about a prophet named Elisha, the disciple of Elijah, of whom we've heard in the baptism site. And Elisha goes to Jericho, and the water's bad. And Elisha takes some salt and pours it into the source, and now the water is healed. It's now fresh and tasty. It's another story of healing. Moreover, remember, Jesus addresses prostitutes, lepers, tax collectors. We have a story about a prostitute here in Jericho. She was one of the people of Jericho in the time of Joshua. Remember, Joshua, Yeshua, it's the same name. And the name of the woman was Rachav the prostitute. She is one of the people, the pagans who live in Jericho. She was supposed to be killed with her family, along with everyone else in Jericho, but no, she survived. How? Because she repented, because she helped the tribes of Israel to take over Jericho. And she was rewarded by that, according to Jewish legend. Much, much later, Rachav repented and she married Joshua. She's Joshua's wife. So we have here a series of stories about curses, about something bad turning good. It's not just the sociological issue here. It is also the spiritual issue. Curing, healing. This is the story of Jericho from a spiritual perspective.